CAEL, absolutely. 30,000 workers. Throughout today's industrial landscape, imagining that massive headcount at one facility seems totally absurd, yet down in Winston-Salem, that figure merely represented everyday reality. Each and every daybreak, an ocean of workers outnumbering typical mid-sized cities across the country poured right onto a lone square mile of North Carolina dirt. These folks were not simply punching clocks. These people stepped inside an independent metropolis constructed completely out of crimson masonry and bright tobacco. We are talking about the nerve center for R.J. Reynolds, the absolute core of a manufacturing dynasty which completely transformed the southern states as it managed to slip smokes into pockets all over the globe. Throughout almost 100 years, this spot functioned as far more than a simple production facility. It served as the absolute heartbeat of the locals. Calling this town home meant joining the Reynolds clan, which was never just some catchy marketing phrase cooked up by executives, but rather an exact reflection of the region's very lifeblood. The production plant acted as a gravitational anchor while the surrounding municipalities simply circled its orbit. The plant controlled exactly when folks rolled out of bed, enjoyed their meals, and passed their Saturday afternoons. Even the local breeze felt thick with commercial progress. A sugary, dense, and instantly recognizable aroma of dried leaves permanently stuck to everyone's garments, drapes, and bodies. Out-of-towners just noticed an odor. However, the residents breathed in the sweet fragrance of cleared home loans and completely stable family destinies. Winston-Salem's actual layout stands as ultimate proof of this overwhelming control. Many manufacturing towns tuck their processing plants away near the city limits, yet Camel City erected its massive commercial shrines directly downtown. Nobody would ever call these structures merely utilitarian. They stood as structural behemoths. Plant number 64, along with its sister facilities, completely dominated the local horizon. Enormous exhaust pipes stabbed through the sky like grand steeples dedicated to the leaf. Executives funded the medical centers delivering their employees babies, constructed the playgrounds keeping the kids busy, and erected massive corporate high-rises attempting to copy the most majestic buildings in Manhattan. Yet holding such a massive manufacturing monopoly also sets up a highly risky contradiction. Tying a whole community's livelihood to just one item, one specific logo, and one main entrance ramps up the risk far beyond what folks generally want to acknowledge. Over several 10-year stretches, the equipment kept running constantly. That deafening rumble of assembly belts provided the soundtrack for kids growing up across the Piedmont region. Citizens figured their paychecks were guaranteed as long as humanity experienced anxiety. Everyone assumed those giant plumes would keep billowing endlessly. If you want to comprehend the trendy remodeled apartments and completely abandoned masonry husks standing there now, you must rewind history back to an era where those corridors roared with relentless production. We need to examine that former powerhouse to truly grasp the lingering spirits left behind. Here lies the tale tracking the ascent, the sheer summit, alongside the unavoidable shutdown of those gears which previously drove a nationwide dynasty. You are about to hear the saga of the Camel production plant. That central engine pumping life into a sprawling municipality right up until the afternoon it just died. Take the 30-day Camel Smoothness Challenge to discover true smoking comfort. Massive corporate dynasties never spring up randomly. Instead, they get hammered out through the ruthless, undeniable realities of terrain. Grasping exactly how Winston-Salem transformed into the ultimate global hub for cigarettes requires examining a highly specific triad of natural assets that simply could not be found anywhere else on the planet. An ideal combination of organic matter, shipping routes, and fuel sources morphed a sleepy southern village into an international juggernaut. We must start our discussion with the ground itself. That iconic crimson earth acts as the defining feature of the North Carolina Piedmont. Any standard agricultural worker considered tilling that crust an absolute disaster. Yet for someone growing smokes, the terrain felt like striking oil. Pairing this unique dirt profile with incredibly sticky weather created the ideal environment for cultivating bright leaf variants. While pipe smokers relied on dense, dark, air-dried blends, the bright leaf variety offered a skinny, fragrant alternative that turned absolutely yellow during the heat drying process. This became the crucial component fueling the massive smoking craze hitting the early 1900s. Establishing his base in this spot essentially placed R.J. Reynolds right atop a mountain of unprocessed goods. The guy never needed to delay production while waiting on shipments. His operation stood squarely in the middle of the picking fields. However, hoarding treasure means nothing without a way to sell it. Back during the 1870s, Winston sat completely surrounded by land and cut off from the world. The founder realized that forging a true dynasty meant tapping into locomotive transit. He refused to sit around hoping for train tracks to show up. Instead, he leveraged his rising clout to guarantee those southern railway lines bypassed standard routes and avoided merely skirting the city limits. He made sure the trains drove straight inside his production floors. That maneuver established an unbelievable supply chain setup, literally years ahead of the curve. Freshly picked plants pulled up to the initial intake bays went through refinement, and subsequently countless completed cartons pushed through the exit bays, heading for the Norfolk harbors before hitting London, Paris, and Tokyo. Next came the massive issue of securing electricity. An industrial facility operating around the clock demands a ton of feeding. Keeping gigantic gears spinning to crank out countless smokes each hour drained absolutely insane levels of power. Once more, the natural landscape offered a perfect solution. Sitting just out to the west were the vast Appalachian coal reserves. Down south, sprawling timberlands supplied the heavy wooden pillars holding up the plant, plus all the firewood needed to run the drying sheds. It was a completely homegrown operation. All necessary materials sat closer than a 100-mile drive. Then you had the local demographics. While Winston operated as a manufacturing hub, it bordered Salem, a strict Moravian community, famous for its intense dedication to hard labor order and skilled artisanry. In them, Reynolds discovered employees who weren't merely seeking paychecks, but rather treated a hard day's grind as a righteous duty. That distinct cultural atmosphere delivered the exact focus required to manage a rapid-fire manufacturing facility. 100 years back, picking this spot was pure tactical genius. He created the quickest route from a seedling planted in the Carolina dirt to a 5-cent coin resting in a buyer's hand. Reynolds wasn't merely putting up another plant. He was weaving a massive engine right into the fabric of the southern countryside. Provided the locomotives kept chugging and the dirt remained rich, locals were convinced this dynasty could withstand anything. Those crimson masonry structures marking the Reynolds domain didn't come from out-of-touch designers sitting high up in fancy offices. Sweat and muscle from folks escaping absolute destitution actually raised those walls. Right around the dawn of the 20th century, Winston-Salem morphed into an irresistible draw, attracting a pair of totally different crowds united only by their urgent hunger to secure reliable, consistent wages. The initial group consisted of Caucasian agricultural workers coming down from the Blue Ridge Highlands. These clans spent decades barely scraping by on the harsh, stony terrain up high, constantly battling sudden freezes, dry spells, and devastating crop diseases just to survive. For these folks, clocking in at Reynolds wasn't some miserable grind. It felt like a safe haven offering absolute security. Securing a spot on the assembly floor guaranteed cash in hand at week's end, no matter the weather, finally allowing their kids to wear decent footwear. These Highlanders carried an intense, self-reliant spirit and the hardcore endurance absolutely necessary to survive those demanding production areas. Concurrently, the facility stood as a shining refuge for African-American households trying to escape the punishing, exploitative tenant farming traps down south. During a dark period marked heavily by legal segregation and widespread institutional racism, R.J. Reynolds made an incredibly bold move for that generation. He brought on thousands of African-American employees. Even though shifts remained totally separated by race and the physical toll was brutal, this offered a precious, crucial stepping stone towards standard middle-class living. For countless black citizens, this cigarette plant marked the very first time they earned actual paper money rather than being forced to use useless tokens or company store debts. A completely fresh sense of financial pride was born right there, hammered out alongside those boiling leaf treatment tanks. The crew playfully dubbed themselves tobacco rats, wearing that rough moniker like a badge of honor. They became much more than mere staff. These people laid the groundwork for entire blue-collar lineages. You'd frequently spot a grandfather, father, and son strolling past the entrance side by side every morning. You had the oldest patriarch recalling the earliest steam-powered equipment, a dad in his absolute prime, and the youngest boy just picking up the mechanical tempo of the lines. The founder knew perfectly well that retaining such a gigantic workforce required playing a bigger role than mere manager. He needed to act like a colossal father figure. So he engineered an environment where the corporation literally supported you your entire life. Management bankrolled the very medical centers delivering his employees babies. The business even constructed the local classrooms where those kids eventually studied. Furthermore, they handed out cheap home loans to finance the endless rows of matching, snug little houses filling up the neighborhoods. This represented company-sponsored caretaking executed with sharp strategic genius. The underlying reasoning made perfect sense. Any labor indebted to the firm for their roof, their kids' schooling, and basic health care won't ever walk off the job. Absolute allegiance became deeply ingrained in Winston-Salem's culture. Earning a paycheck wasn't the half of it. Your entire existence revolved within an ecosystem Reynolds engineered. These families swapped clear country breezes for the dense, dark grime floating around the manufacturing plant. As a payoff, they gained long-term security that appeared tougher than the local masonry. Those laborers became the town's pulse, ensuring the corporation remained completely bulletproof so long as they worked. Grasping the true nature of this massive plant requires looking past the architecture and viewing it instead as a massive animate creature. Morning shifts never kicked off by checking a wristwatch. Everything began with an earth-shattering shriek from the plant's steam siren right at 5:30 in the morning. That noise did way more than just rouse the staff. The blast violently shook glass in every local neighborhood, serving as the area's main pulse. Come 6 o'clock, those silent roads instantly shifted into a massive flowing crowd. Multitudes of locals barely awake surged toward those massive crimson entryways just like an unstoppable ocean swell. Crossing that threshold basically dropped you into an alternate universe. The initial shock didn't come from the volume, but from the actual air quality. Breathing felt completely different as you were inhaling a dense, damp cloud of processing syrups. Picture a sugary, clinging vapor made of molasses, licorice, and rum, meant to season the leaves. That scent hung so thick you practically chewed it with every breath. Suddenly, the quiet completely broke apart. Once those gigantic bond-sack rollers kicked into high gear, the thunderous mechanical rumble was so steady and ear-splitting, it ironically morphed into a weird kind of hush. Deep within those corridors, the crews naturally forged their own unique codes to handle the grueling daily grind. The crew had to rely on reading lips and their own custom hand signals to talk. The roaring machinery completely drowned out any spoken words. Down on the line, keeping the pace was everything. Workers' fingers flew in a dizzying frenzy, carefully organizing, removing the stalks, and pressing the foliage perfectly flat. Repeating those exact gestures 10,000 times per day. Once mid-morning rolled around, that brick building transformed into a blazing furnace. During those muggy North Carolina summers, the plant held in all the vapor from the boiling tanks, making the atmosphere so thick you could almost chew it. However, right at 12 o'clock, the madness halted completely. That midday siren brought on a jarring quiet that somehow rang in your ears worse than the racket. This exact moment served as the true beating heart of the community. The employees poured out onto the shipping platforms or the adjacent town plaza, popping open tin boxes packed with cold-baked goods, dark coffee, and fried chicken. For exactly 30 minutes, all workplace rank completely disappeared. Folks swapped local rumors, quietly discussed labor leaders, and grabbed a fast smoke break. Funny enough, they usually puffed on self-rolled ones right before the siren blared to pull everyone back to the grueling afternoon shift. When the sun started sinking past the chimneys at 5 o'clock in the evening, the last siren announced total freedom. A tired wave of laborers wearing denim and ash-colored uniforms poured right out onto the pavement. The distinct smell of the plant clung to them all the way to their houses. It was a lingering mix of perspiration and dried leaves that branded everyone as a loyal subject of the company. Come 6 o'clock in the evening, every tavern was packed solid. Patio chairs rocked back and forth, and the bustling tobacco town finally took a breath, only to spring back into action 12 hours down the line. This massive plant pumped out way more than just smokes. It actually engineered a major societal movement that completely shaped the 1900s in the United States. If you want to grasp how this sprawling brick empire got so huge, you need to dig into the actual recipe they were using. Back before the Camel label hit the shelves, in 1913, the smoking industry was totally scattered, mostly filled with rough pipe blends, chew and pricey imported Turkish smokes. Mr. R.J. Reynolds completely flipped the script when he invented the classic American mix. He developed a highly guarded, carefully measured combination of 3 very specific plants. He took the sugary, heat-treated bright leaf out of North Carolina, mixed it with Kentucky's robust burley variety, and added a pinch of sun-baked Turkish crop to give it a unique scent. That combination was far more than a simple formula. It was an absolute game changer. We are talking about the very first widely manufactured, ready-to-buy pack of smokes that tasted exactly the same every single time. A dock worker down in New Orleans and an attorney up in Boston were getting the exact same flavor profile. Back then, buying stuff was always a shot in the dark, but this brand delivered rock-solid reliability. However, an amazing item still requires an iconic mascot to sell it. The advertising team struck absolute gold when they found Old Joe, a real-life dromedary that worked with a touring carnival. They slapped his image right in front of some desert dunes and palm trees. That design sold a feeling of thrilling overseas elegance to blue-collar folks who practically never left their hometowns. By dropping just a couple of pennies, an everyday guy could carry a little slice of the foreign world right there in his jacket. The brand's massive breakthrough, though, was ultimately driven by global warfare. All through World War I and World War II, the production lines cranked up to max capacity. These packs weren't merely being hawked to the troops. The armed forces actually baked them directly into the standard daily rations. Uncle Sam viewed smoking as crucial for mental health, using it to keep spirits high, while guys were stuck in the muddy front lines. The National Defense Department basically hooked a whole wave of young guys on that specific Winston-Salem recipe. Once those veterans finally sailed back stateside, they carried more than just combat ribbons. They came back with a permanent addiction and a fierce dedication to that specific company. Fast forward to the 1950s, and the facility was an absolute powerhouse, pumping out an insane 100 million units daily just to keep up with the crazy demand. It truly was the ultimate money-making machine. Dirt cheap to manufacture, practically weightless for transport, and built strictly to be used up and tossed away. Plus, it involved way more than just the chemical rush. The whole routine was a major part of the appeal. Striking that match and letting out that initial heavy breath turned into the classic symbol of a guy stealing a quick 5-minute breather from his hard labor. That specific crop bankrolled the towering office buildings, medical centers, and college campuses scattered all across North Carolina. Countless people simply could not bring themselves to quit buying it. For decades on end, it felt like the cash river was never going to dry up. Around the middle of the 1950s, the R.J. Reynolds operation grew way past being a normal company. It basically operated like its own independent manufacturing country. Winston-Salem ended up holding the title for the richest town per person in the whole southeastern block of the country. And absolutely every single penny of that immense wealth led right back to the steady buzzing of those massive production belts. When things were booming the whole campus essentially acted as a completely separate metropolis. It was this gigantic red brick compound fully equipped with an internal security squad, a dedicated firehouse, and an independent electrical grid strong enough to run a moderately sized country. Nobody looking from the outside could even begin to wrap their heads around how enormous the whole setup really was. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the smoke kept pouring out of those stacks and those front doors stayed wide open. Getting hired at Reynolds wasn't merely employment, it was a supreme point of pride. Flashing that corporate badge was basically an all-access pass. That piece of plastic secured your house, financed your vehicle, and ensured a comfortable retirement standard most folks globally could only dream about. You could practically feel the deep, shared community spirit everywhere. The residents of Winston-Salem carried a rock-solid conviction that as long as humanity dealt with anxiety and kept drawing breath, this town would stay at the absolute heart of manufacturing. Corporate philanthropy back in those days reached mythical status. Wealth from the founders cascaded across the region, heavily funding local theater community green spaces. And moving Wake Forest University, the corporation turned a dusty manufacturing hub into a thriving artistic haven. Come winter holidays, those towering industrial chimneys, the ultimate icons of hard work, were draped in thousands of lights resembling massive glowing tapers seen from far across the North Carolina Piedmont. Back in those days, it truly felt like one big business family, blurring any distinction between personal existence and corporate triumph. The towering corporate headquarters absolutely commanded the local horizon, an architectural marvel so majestic and well-balanced that the designers behind New York's iconic Empire State Building famously modeled their own project on it. The entire municipality radiated an aura of enduring, unshakable stability. Locals gazing up at the dense, sugary exhaust billowing from the plants never viewed it as smog. To them, it was the sweet scent of cash. Everyone figured those profit checks would keep coming and the production lines would hum eternally. From their perspective, that massive corporate enterprise stood as an immovable permanent fixture. Yet right beneath the imposing shadows of those massive masonry structures, the broader society was already shifting gears. For over 40 years, that massive corporate dynasty seemed entirely bulletproof and destined to last. Yet right around the mid-1960s, Winston-Salem's solid brick exterior showed its initial fractures. Things didn't just implode overnight or crash in spectacular fashion. Rather, a gradual, unsettling change was sweeping across the social landscape of the United States. That initial heavy hit arrived in 1964, when the top medical official published a groundbreaking study connecting the habit to severe respiratory consequences. Overnight, the exact goods that bankrolled local medical centers and paid for higher education were suddenly branded a massive public wellness disaster. Inside the plant, that proud growth mindset quickly pivoted into a frantic, high-stakes survival mode. Management initially tried inventing their way out of the negative press, aggressively pivoting toward heavy mechanization to solve their problems. They brought in gigantic rapid-fire equipment, robotic beasts capable of rolling product 10 times quicker than the manual laborers they pushed out. Though production quotas stayed strong, the veteran floor workers started noticing a rather disturbing trend. The assembly areas grew increasingly deafening, yet the break areas and changing facilities felt noticeably deserted. Technology was essentially eating alive the very personnel that formerly served as its lifeblood. Afterward, the courtroom battles began. That 1971 broadcast prohibition could completely rob the iconic label of its boldest, most engaging marketing platform. The corporate behemoth had to bite its tongue, vanishing from broadcasts and retreating to outdoor signs and magazines. Rising levies and fresh environmental rules created unrelenting pushback for a sector that historically ran without any oversight whatsoever. Winston-Salem locals desperately tried to protect their community by living in sheer denial. They brushed off those medical warnings as meddlesome northern nonsense or bogus research aimed at crushing their southern lifestyle. Yet the truth couldn't be ignored. The unspoken agreement linking the town and the agricultural product was completely falling apart. The town's heartbeat kept pumping. Yet for the first time in 100 years, that exhaust billowing overhead no longer signaled wealth. It felt like a massive red flag. The conclusion of that legendary brand's dynasty didn't go off with a massive bang. It unfolded through empty, clanking noises that marked the demise of an entire era. Heading into the late 1980s and early 90s, the impending doom was crystal clear. It was practically carved right into Winston-Salem's horizon. Once the formal notice regarding the plant shutting down finally dropped, the entire town mourned like they had lost a close relative. That instant erased a 100-year-old legacy, leaving 30,000 folks questioning their purpose without the giant corporation that practically raised them. Those final clock-ins felt like a bizarre, gut-wrenching funeral march in steel-toed footwear. Guys who devoted 40 years standing in the exact same spot on the assembly line strolled out of those giant masonry archways and never looked back. Everyone just stared at their boots, actively ignoring the commercial rental placards getting pounded into the ruddy dirt right by the entrance. Nobody threw a party, no popping bottles, just the depressing, systematic routine of unplugging equipment that had been roaring loudly for a solid century. Bit by bit, those gigantic manufacturing belts completely powered down. For the first time anyone could remember, absolute quiet swept through the massive church-like corridors of plant number 64. That ensuing stillness was downright chilling. The absence of sound wasn't the only thing missing. The smell was gone too. That rich aroma of aged leaf and dark syrup, which hung over the town for decades, faded away. In its place came a lifeless, chilly funk of wet cement and dead breeze. When the final shift clocked out, the sharp snap of the time clock rang across the vacant hall, echoing like a dying pulse on a monitor. Beyond those walls, the fallout hit hard. Late-night cafes catering to the graveyard crew, local salons where folks endlessly debated baseball, and retail shops banking on holiday paychecks, everything started drying up. The town's primary financial lifeline was completely severed. For quite a bleak stretch, Winston-Salem seemed destined to become a completely deserted wasteland. Yet the sharpest sting didn't come from going broke. It came from losing their core identity. Households that proudly wore their Reynolds credentials abruptly became invisible strangers right inside their own community. Those colossal masonry structures, previously standing as icons of international dominance, turned into empty shells overnight. Padlocks secured the entrances, plywood covered the glass, and a restless quiet settled over a bustling community that used to buzz around the clock. Camel City essentially morphed into a gloomy, shadowy landscape, where the sole remnants of that dynasty were clay-colored dirt clinging to panes and the quiet memories shared by folks who once treated these massive manufacturing plants like their very own flesh and blood. Over several years, the massive husks of the Reynolds Corporation acted like quiet grave markers. Locals started referring to Winston-Salem as a relic of a forgotten era. Then an incredible shift took place. The community recognized that even though the crops vanished, the industrial blueprints and the rugged durability of those crimson facades still stood incredibly strong. Areas previously thick with fumes and sticky syrup started breathing in the odors of new primer and advanced air conditioning units. Nowadays, Camel City has fully rebranded itself into a cutting-edge development hub. They never demolished the gigantic plant, number 64. Instead, they gutted it and packed it with tomorrow's possibilities right where countless laborers used to roll up smokes. A huge team of researchers currently charts DNA sequences and creates groundbreaking healing therapies. Brightly lit corridors that formerly vibrated from roaring manufacturing equipment now hum with tapping laptops and the highly focused chatter of driven startup founders. This complete overhaul stands as a brilliant example of citywide revitalization. Former shipping bays once stacked with dried leaves have turned into lively espresso bars and artisan beer joints. The old Central Plaza, previously known for quiet labor organizing, serves as an open green space where kids run around on the exact soil their ancestors walked over to clock in. A sleek contemporary vibe has taken the place of intense manufacturing grime, yet the spirit of that old dynasty remains entirely present. You will spot the washed-out camel emblem painted on exterior walls, while the towering Reynolds structure continues to dominate the horizon. It operates as an upscale lodge these days, putting visitors up in suites where the bigwigs of an international cartel called the Shots. What that facility left behind goes way beyond the cash it generated. It lives on in the sheer toughness it built into locals. Winston-Salem did more than simply outlive the loss of its core. It cultivated a fresh one. It showed the world how to honor history without getting trapped by it. When dusk falls on the modern campus and the smog has vanished, the breeze feels crisp and the gears have stopped grinding. Still, if you lean against those vintage masonry blocks and shut your lids, you might catch the faint sound of a siren, no longer summoning folks to the daily grind, but serving as a memory of the giant that founded this town and the courageous folks with the strength of 10 men who built it.